Hello my friends and welcome back to another Baldur's Gate 3 tier list and guide. Hope you're all doing well. Today we're covering Cantrips. This is of course an update video to my previous Cantrips tier list, because in patch 8 they released 3 new Cantrips which completely change how you have to evaluate Cantrip selection. That video also was made more than a year ago. I no longer agree with everything that I said in it, so I wanted to update this video to bring it into the modern era. Cantrip selection is the most important character creation decision that a spellcaster will make, because your cantrips are always there for you no matter what. They don't cost anything to use, so you'll always have them. So just like choosing best friends, making sure that you choose reliable cantrips is extremely important. For most spellcasters, your main combat cantrip is going to be the single most common action that you take across a playthrough. So you're going to be using these a lot. So it's very, very important to know which ones are good and which ones are bad. How I'm rating these cantrips is very simple. Should you take them on characters that have access to them? And if you cast them often, will they help you win Honor Mode? Of course, optimization is a tool to help you have more fun. So if you enjoy cantrips lower on this list, keep taking them and keep enjoying them. That's always, of course, the most important thing, but the ones high on the list will make the game easier. In S tier, I'm placing cantrips that are critical. Pretty much every character that has access to this spell should take it and will use it very frequently. It'll be used constantly across your playthroughs. In A tier, these are great cantrips that most parties should try to have access to. They'll be mainstays of most of your strategies. In B tier, cantrips that have a lot of utility, they may have interesting but more narrow uses or be useful to certain categories of build, and generally these will not be bad ones to have access to. In C tier, cantrips that do have uses, maybe a specific build uses them or a couple encounters in the game they excel in, but generally speaking you won't miss them if you don't have them, so they're more marginal. And then in D tier, spells that are very low impact and which you can fairly safely skip. Finally, before I begin, I do want to take a quick moment to say thank you so much to Josh Hobbs for the $5 donation, Poor Biggles for the $12, Scott Myers for the $10, and Joe Falk and I Want Some Dim Sum for becoming channel members. Thank you so much, my friends. I really appreciate the support. It really means so much to me. Alright, let's talk cantrips. Let's start with Acid Splash. Acid Splash is the first of the damaging cantrips, which is great to talk about because cantrips basically come in two types. Either they do a small amount of damage, or they provide some form of utility. And many of the damaging cantrips have a little bit of utility on top of the damage that they do. Damage cantrips also share the effect that they get better as you level up, usually gaining more damage dice. Acid Splash in particular is a 60-foot range cantrip with a 7-foot radius that does 1d6 of acid damage, and then it gains an additional d6 of damage at level 5 and level 10. So starting at level 5 it does 2d6 of damage for an average of 7, and at level 10 it does 3d6 of acid damage for an average of 10.5. It's 60-foot range, and it is one of 2 AoE cantrips in the game, so you can often hit more than one enemy with it, though in order to do that you have to target enemies that are close together, so you may not be targeting the enemy that you actually want to target if you want to get the most damage out of this spell, because it has some targeting restrictions on it. It is a dexterity saving throw, and if enemies pass, then they take 0 damage. So the question that we have to ask when evaluating Acid Splash and the other damage cantrips is, does it do more damage than casting something else? And so will you want to use it in most cases where you want to do damage? Will you prefer this spell, or will you prefer to cast something else in order to kill enemies as fast as possible? The answer for Acid Splash is that it doesn't. Doing only a d6 of damage means that against single targets, you would always rather have one of the higher damaging spells. And while it does technically do more average damage against multiple targets, it comes with some targeting restrictions, because that only comes up if enemies are close together, and you're not catching an ally in the AoE and stuff like that. But more importantly, because it is a saving throw targeting cantrip, it's going to be much less reliable than the ones that target armor class in general. Enemies are more likely to pass their saving throws than you are to miss your attacks against your armor class, usually. And because it targets an enemy's dexterity save, it is often going to be at a significant disadvantage compared to other cantrips. Dexterity save is the second worst type of save to target after Constitution. It's the second highest save on average across all enemies. And in particular, when cantrips are most impactful in the early game, a lot of the enemies that you're going to be fighting are things like goblins and spiders that have really high dexterity saves compared to their other saving throws. So Acid Splash is just gonna miss a lot. What you don't want when you're casting a cantrip is to have saving throw succeeded and to have nothing happen. And Acid Splash is just going to yield that result an unacceptably large amount of the time. So the average damage of casting this spell, even though it does area of effect damage, is just going to be much lower than most other damaging cantrips. There's two exceptions for when Acid Splash is actually really good. One of these is on Evocation Wizards, who get the ability to have their damaging cantrips with a saving throw still do half the damage on a miss, and that's really good. Guaranteed damage is excellent. Guaranteed damage in an AoE is really good. You also add your intelligence as an Evocation Wizard to your damaging spells, so you're going to do even more damage overall. So the fact that it gives you guaranteed AoE damage means that for Evocation Wizards in particular, Acid Splash is worth taking. The other use case is a quality of life thing, which is that it's very good at breaking boxes. If there's a lot of boxes around, you can break a bunch of them with Acid Splash, which can really speed up your looting. Honestly, this is the reason that you should take this cantrip in general, because that quality of life thing I find very helpful and really enjoy being able to do that. Less important on console where you have the AoE loot button, but on PC this can actually be very helpful. Because only one class really wants this spell for its combat effectiveness, I'm going to give Acid Splash C tier for marginal, because Evocation Wizards make good use of it. Nobody else should usually take this spell. Blade Ward. Blade Ward is a spell that you cast on yourself, and it lasts for 2 turns, no concentration required, and while it's active you have resistance, taking half damage from bludgeoning, piercing, and slashing damage. So all physical damage dealt to you when you have Blade Ward up is halved. On the face of it, this isn't an amazing trade, even though it's a very powerful effect, because you're spending your action, so you're basically passing the turn, in order to take half damage for 2 turns. Spending one of your turns for half of each of your enemy's next 2 turns is not a great trade. You know, it comes out action neutral. Basically, they lose 1 turn over the course of 2 turns, and you lose 1 turn when you first cast it. But you would be better off in most cases, if that is the trade, just progressing the fight. However, there's some scenarios where that math doesn't actually hold true. For example, if you're surrounded by a lot of enemies and you cast Blade Ward, you can trade your turn for half of the turns of 4 or 5 enemies. Suddenly, that's a great trade in terms of action economy, and Blade Ward is very good in those cases. It also has a lot of synergy with a bunch of effects that are available in Baldur's Gate. If you have temporary hit points, like from Armor of Agathis, Blade Ward effectively doubles that amount. If you're taking half damage, then those temporary hit points go twice as far, so you can take twice as much incoming damage before those temp HP run out, and you can maintain the efficiency of a spell like Armor of Agathis for much longer, both taking half as much damage and dealing twice as much damage in return. It also synergizes excellently with any source of flat damage reduction. If you have a piece of armor that reduces all incoming damage by 2, Blade Ward multiplies the incoming damage before that reduction gets applied. So if an enemy is doing 10 damage and you would be reducing it by 2, that's a 20% reduction in the in the incoming damage that you would take. If you have Blade Ward, now you're taking 5 damage from that 10 incoming damage, reduce that by 2, and you're reducing the total damage that you would take by 40%. So it doubled the effectiveness of the flat damage reduction that you have. Blade Ward, in those cases, is really solid. So it goes very, very well with temporary hit points, very, very well with flat damage reduction, and very well if you just need to buy a turn. If you're surrounded by a bunch of enemies and you need your character to just live for 1 turn while the rest of your party gets there to rescue them, Blade Ward has a lot of use cases in those scenarios. There are a couple things holding it back, though, in Baldur's Gate. One is that there's a lot of ways to get this effect without actually casting it. Damage resistances can show up from the buff on heal items, which give you this spell whenever you heal an ally. So those allies may not want to cast Blade Ward because they might just have it. If you use camp casters, you can cast Warding Bond on the allies, and then it doesn't stack with Blade Ward, so players who use that mechanic will also not want to use Blade Ward as an actual spell cast. But this spell is so powerful that even though you won't use it in every combat, it has so many synergies with things that a lot of builds are doing, and it's also just a great fallback option in an emergency, and it can let you really manipulate the action economy in your favor. It makes healing better, it makes incoming damage much less severe. Blade Ward is a very powerful tool, and while you won't use it in every combat, it's still one that your party should definitely have access to. A tier. Bone Chill. Bone Chill is available to sorcerers, wizards, and warlocks, as well as Death Domain clerics, and does a d8 of necrotic damage, going up to 2d8 at level 5 and 3d8 at level 10, on an attack. That makes it a little bit more reliable than damage cantrips that target saving throws, because it's usually easier to hit enemy armor class than for them to fail a save, and you can critically hit with it to increase the damage and stuff like that even more. And while necrotic damage isn't the best damage type, there's a lot of enemies that resist it, you'll be able to use it against enemies that don't resist or are not immune to necrotic damage, and of course if you're a Death Domain cleric, you ignore that entirely. In addition to that damage, which is already pretty solid for a 60-foot range attack roll cantrip, Bone Chill has an additional effect. Enemies hit by it cannot heal for a full turn. There's no saving throw on this effect, they just can't heal. And if they're undead, they take disadvantage on all of their attack rolls. Turning off healing is very powerful. There's a lot of enemies in the game with incidental healing or with one healing ally in an encounter, and being able to turn that off can be very useful. Some enemies who heal a lot, you can do effectively hundreds of points of damage by casting Bone Chill a couple times in an encounter and turning off their heals to keep their health low. Giving undead disadvantage on attack rolls is also extremely powerful. While a lot of undead are immune or resistant to necrotic damage, still having an effect that gives them disadvantage on all their attacks with no saving throw is very powerful, and being able to do that can mitigate tons of damage, especially in the more undead heavy encounters in Act 3. I don't think that Bone Chill is going to be your go-to damage cantrip on most characters, but it has such strong utility with the healing reduction, and it's not significantly worse for damage than the ones that I am going to suggest, that I think that Bone Chill is just a great tool for every party to have, and goes straight into A tier. Booming Blade. So Booming Blade, of course, is the first of the new cantrips added in patch 8, and oh boy, is it a good one. Booming Blade has a couple effects. It is used as part of a weapon attack, so when you cast it, you make a normal weapon attack, making your normal hit roll. So it doesn't use your casting stat, it uses the weapon stat that you would normally be using. So if you're a fighter casting Booming Blade while swinging your greatsword, it's going to roll using your strength in order to hit and add your strength to damage, in addition to the Booming Blade effect. That Booming Blade effect is, it puts a debuff on the enemy for one turn, where if they move, they take a d8 of thunder damage. At level 5, it does this, it puts this debuff on, and if they move, they take 2d8 of thunder damage, but also, it adds a d8 of thunder damage to your initial attack, for a total possible 3d8 of thunder damage, if you hit an enemy and then they move. Finally, at level 11, for some reason it upgrades at level 11 instead of level 10 like every other cantrip, Booming Blade will do 2d8 of initial thunder damage, and then 3d8 if the enemy moves. The damage when enemies move is pretty relevant. They have to move voluntarily, so you can't shove them, but it's still a bunch of additional damage, and it's free because it comes as part of a weapon attack. And there's lots of ways to encourage enemies to move. You can have the character that hit them and applied the Booming Blade effect shove them away if they have high enough strength, then the enemy has to move back to close to melee range. Or you can just walk away and tank the attack of opportunity, or deny their reaction, or use it on something else, and then walk away from the enemy so they have to move to follow you afterwards. You can also hit them with Booming Blade and then shove them with another character with a ranged attack or something. Say a Warlock with Eldritch Blast for Repelling Blast can shove that enemy away, and then they have to walk back and they'll take extra damage. Free extra damage is incredible, and because Booming Blade just works like a normal weapon attack, it's completely free. Any turn that you were going to make a weapon attack, you can be using Booming Blade instead. So even if it didn't have the initial damage, it would still be an S tier spell, because free action economy free damage is incredible. But it does have the initial damage. Adding 2d8 to all of your weapon attacks is ridiculous. While you can only use it once per action, it still works with extra attack. So you can cast Booming Blade and then make another weapon attack. And you can use it once per action, not once per turn. So if you have an effect like Haste or Action Surge that gives you extra actions, you can use Booming Blade multiple times. A character that has, say, a fighter with Haste for using Booming Blade 3 times in a turn is adding 6d8 of thunder damage to their attacks for free, doing a ridiculous amount of extra damage. Thunder damage is also one of the best damage types in the game. Almost nothing resists it. It synergizes with reverberation and radiating orbs and stuff like that as well. So you're just getting an absurd amount of damage for free. Booming Blade has enabled entire categories of builds all by itself. The existence of this spell has made half-elf or high-elf and high-half-elf some of the best races in the game for martial characters just entirely on its own, because they can select a wizard cantrip, which can be Booming Blade, making those characters just more powerful for melee characters than pretty much any other option. This spell is so good because free is amazing. You know, there's no better price for it. And not only is it free, it also has an extremely powerful effect. S tier, of course, for Booming Blade. I just can't say enough that's good about this spell. Any character that is going to make weapon attacks should try to get this. It's so much extra damage for free. Bursting Sinew. So Bursting Sinew is another one of the new cantrips that was added in patch 8. And it allows you to explode a corpse that's on the ground. It has to be a fresh corpse, ones that have burned from fire or something like that, or been used to summon a zombie, will not work for Bursting Sinew, and you can only use the corpse once in order to do this. And then when you explode the corpse, it does a d10 of piercing damage, increasing to 2d10 and then 3d10 at levels 5 and 10, with a dexterity save to negate. It's a 10-foot radius, so bigger than Acid Splash, and does more damage than Acid Splash, but has a significantly more restrictive targeting requirement. Something has to be dead in the area, and enemies have to be clustered up around it. So while it has pretty high upsides, the chances of getting the maximum effect out of Bursting Sinew are extremely small. Once enemies have started dying, you probably don't need AoE damage anyways, because you're starting to kill enemies, so the chances of them being clustered around one of these corpses is fairly low, and if they are clustered enough for Bursting Sinew to be good, maybe it's a good opportunity to use a leveled spell and take them all out at once with a Fireball or something. This spell's targeting restrictions are just so severe that unfortunately it's very difficult to make good use out of it, and even if you do get a bunch of enemies around it, it still has the same problem as Acid Splash of being dex save to completely negate the damage, so enemies will just often resist it. Unfortunately, because it's super cool and I really love this spell and I really enjoy using it, it isn't very strong, and if you want this effect, Acid Splash, which is already not a great spell, is usually going to be better, so it goes into D tier. Dancing Lights. Dancing Lights is a concentration spell where you create some little balls of light that create a lit radius around them. It takes your concentration and it only lasts for 10 turns, so unlike a light, which takes no concentration and will just light up everything, Dancing Lights you have to actually spend an important resource on and use your action closer to when you actually want the light in order to make this happen. If you just want Dancing Lights for the light, just use the light spell or set something on fire or carry a torch. Spending your concentration on lighting up an area is just not a good trade, usually. And certainly not worth selecting as a cantrip, though the Chimera's Locket item that gives you this can let you use Dancing Lights if you do want it. There is one very marginal use case for dancing lights, though. They count as having weight, so if you put them on a vent or a trap, one of the like vents that releases poison gas, they actually do block those vents. So they can be a very useful tool for navigating some of the more annoying areas in the game, like in Ethel's dungeon. You can cast dancing lights to put these over the vents and stop the poison gas from coming out. That's pretty much the only use case for this spell, though, so I'm going to put it in D tier. Eldritch Blast. Eldritch Blast is Warlock exclusive, unless you spend your magical secrets pick on it as a bard, and it does a d10 of force damage with an attack roll. Already, this makes it basically the best damaging cantrip. A d10 of force damage is an amazing amount of damage for a cantrip. It's a really high number, and it's force damage, which is one of the best damage types. Almost nothing in the game resists it, uses an attack roll so it can critically hit, and all of that. However, the really cool thing about Eldritch Blast is that it scales in a unique way compared to the other cantrips. Every other damaging cantrip adds dice to the damage. Eldritch Blast adds attack rolls. So when you hit level 5, instead of doing one attack roll for 2d10 damage, you do 2 attack rolls, each for a d10. And then at level 10, you get 3 attack rolls. This is really good for a number of reasons. Firstly, having 3 separate attack rolls, while it's the same average damage, means that you're much more likely to get a result in the middle, which is really good, because it makes it much, much more reliable. Cantrips are often used to finish off weak enemies, so Eldritch Blast will allow you to do that much more reliably, because if at least one of the beams hits, then you're going to do at least some damage. The enemy of optimization is randomness, so Eldritch Blast, in addition to just being stronger than the other cantrips, is also less random, and that makes it significantly more reliable. The other thing that this lets you do is split the damage across multiple enemies. You can target different creatures with your Eldritch Blast beams, so it can effectively be an AoE spell. In addition to that, having 3 separate attack rolls means 3 separate rolls for critical hits, so not only is it going to be more reliable in terms of hitting, it's going to be much more reliable in terms of landing critical hits, which can matter a lot for warlocks who have special effects on critical hits. Speaking of warlocks, warlocks also get Agonizing Blast, which lets you add your charisma modifier to cantrip damage. Since Eldritch Blast is doing 3 separate damage instances, that effect gets added 3 times over. So a warlock with 20 charisma adds 15 total damage to their Eldritch Blasts, whereas they would only add 5 total damage to their Firebolts. The amount of damage that you can do with Eldritch Blast is ridiculous. In addition to that, it triggers any other on-hit effects, things like the Callous Glow Ring, the Hex spell, anything that generates reverberation charges or radiating orb charges or arcane acuity charges or things like that, all trigger off of Eldritch Blast individually for each beam. So you get incredible synergy and utility. By default, this is the best damaging cantrip, and then if you add in all the things that it lets you do, it's just far and away the best damaging cantrip for just the most damage. There are tons of builds oriented around Eldritch Blast exclusively, because this spell is just so incredibly good. Both coming because it is just more average damage than any other damaging cantrip, and going because it's more reliable than any other damage cantrip. Eldritch Blast is just the best one for killing enemies, obviously S tier. Firebolt. Firebolt is available to sorcerers and wizards and is a 60-foot range attack roll for a d10 of fire damage, going up to 2 and then 3d10 at levels 5 and 10 respectively. It's the most damage of a cantrip for sorcerers and wizards, because both Bone Chill and Ray of Frost are attack rolls for a d8 of damage, so Firebolt is going to be your best damaging option. But unlike those, it doesn't have any rider effect, Ray of Frost reducing movement speed, and Bone Chill reducing healing. The question is an extra 1 damage on average, and then 2 and then 3, extra damage on average worth losing out on those rider effects? And the answer is not terribly. Usually Ray of Frost is going to be more impactful than an extra 1 damage because the debuffs that you get from Ray of Frost and Bone Chill are better than Firebolt. However, Firebolt does have one very important piece of utility, which is it lights fires. There are lots and lots of times in Baldur's Gate 3 where it's really good to be able to just light a fire at 60-foot range. And doing that while damaging an enemy with a very solid damaging cantrip is also a really nice factor. So it's the highest damage of these cantrips, and while it doesn't have the same utility when actually used against an enemy, being able to light fires is just really, really good. There's lots of times where that will be more damage than any other option, so Firebolt is still something that most parties should have access to. A tier. Friend. Friends gives you advantage on charisma checks against a target for 10 turns. It requires your concentration, and you use it in dialogue typically. When you're trying to bluff or persuade somebody, you cast friends on them, and then you have advantage on that roll. That's very powerful. Being able to pass these skill checks is really important and will give you significant advantages throughout the playthrough. There are a lot of really impactful persuasion checks that you're going to be making in Baldur's Gate 3, so friends will allow you to make those significantly more easily. However, on high difficulties, on Tactician and on Honor mode, it counts as a crime, so it can turn neutral characters hostile. And also on every difficulty, it will cause you to lose approval with your companions if you use it on them. So don't use it on your companions unless you want to lose approval with them, and be very careful with how you use it on high difficulties with neutral characters. There's a couple ways to avoid getting arrested or having them turn hostile. It doesn't count until the duration of the effect runs out, so if you hide or disguise yourself, or fast travel away, then they won't care that you used friends on them. But if you ever forget to do this, it can be pretty dangerous in an honor mode run. That being said, a lot of the most important persuasion checks in the game, the enemies are going to be hostile if you fail the check anyways. Some of the most impactful ones are the Act 2 bosses that you can avoid the fights if you pass the persuasion checks, and it's totally free to use friends on those because they were going to get mad if you failed the checks anyways. So there's actually not as many downsides to this spell on high difficulties as you might think. Obviously, you have to be a little bit careful with how you use it, and if you are doing the thing where you fast travel away, it does cost you, precious real life time on this earth in order to use this, so you have to weigh how much you care about that. But it is a very powerful effect, and even if you only use it on characters who are going to turn hostile anyways, it's still extremely powerful, very, very good for a party face, A tier. Also, free and amazing to use on lower difficulties. Guidance. So Guidance, in terms of the impact that it has on your playthrough, is probably the single best spell in Baldur's Gate 3. It's a concentration spell, lasts for 10 turns, and gives you an extra d4 on any ability checks that you make. So when you're doing skill checks like lockpicking, like doing dialogue checks, or anything like that, you get an extra bonus to succeed. This is super powerful, and it's a cantrip, so it's basically free to use. So on every skill check that you ever make in the entire game, you should strive to have guidance. You do have to be aware that it's a concentration spell, so if you have other concentration spells running, like say Shield of Faith, casting guidance will turn that off. Which can be a little bit dangerous, so you do have to keep that in mind. But no party should leave home without guidance. The impact that it has on your playthrough simply cannot be overstated. I like to have two characters that have this, either naturally or from the amulet that lets you cast it, so that if one is reacting with something else, like friends, for example, you can still cast guidance on that skill check. Because two characters have it, so you can use friends or something like that to gain advantage and have the bonus from guidance. The amount of failures that this turns into successes is just ridiculous. Also, it's actually important to note that it is a concentration spell, and there's a couple cases where having a concentration spell that's a cantrip can be really good. The Vital Conduit Boots give you temporary hit points when you cast a concentration spell, so this lets you get those for free. The Concentrated Blast Illithid power, you can cast and cancel guidance in order to use Concentrated Blast, and again get that for free. And the ring that does extra psychic damage when you're concentrating on a spell, that also works with guidance. So the fact that it's concentration also has a bunch of extra bonuses, but mostly, it just makes you so much better at doing everything that you're going to do in the entire game. Obviously S tier. Light. Light does what it says on the tin. It makes a light. You cast it on an object, and it makes that object glow, casting a light in a 25-foot radius. If you cast it on an ally, it makes their weapon glow for the entirety of the long rest, so that ally will cast light everywhere they go. If you cast it on an object, it lasts for 20 turns, and so you can use it to light one encounter if you want to cast it before that encounter starts. There are lots of dark areas in Baldur's Gate 3 where having a light can be very useful, though some parties may prefer to operate in darkness instead, so it will depend on what your party's doing, whether you actually need to light things. Lighting is less important in Baldur's Gate 3 than it is in a lot of other D&D games, like Solasta, Crown of the Magister cares a lot more about lighting conditions than Baldur's Gate 3 does, but it's still pretty relevant. Characters without dark vision will often have to make their attacks with disadvantage if things aren't lit, and there are some unlit locations, though not as many as you might expect. Having access to some form of light is super, super important, though obviously every party has lots of ways to make it, by setting fires, by having torches, and so on. But light is probably the best, because it doesn't require your hands. You don't have to hold a torch in your hands. It lasts all day, doesn't take your concentration, has a reasonable radius and everything, so it's very good if you just need to light up an area. There are lots of builds that need to do this, and lots of parties that need to do this. Also makes Act 2 a lot easier, makes it easier to navigate without turning up the contrast on your monitor and everything like that, so just a really solid spell. It does exactly what you want it to do, and most parties want that. A tier. Mage Hand. So Mage Hand is unique amongst cantrips in that it's not free to cast. You can only cast it once per short rest. So it actually does have a real cost to use this spell compared to every other cantrip. However, Mage Hand is still a very powerful tool. When you cast it, you get an independent summon that can move by itself and can throw objects and interact with things. This is extremely powerful in terms of out-of-combat utility. You can use it to trigger traps, or flip levers, or go fetch an object that's inside a cloud of poison gas, stuff like that. So it has tons and tons of uses outside of combat. You can also have it scout ahead of you. You can send it through the little cracks in the walls in order to interact with those things that you need a tiny character to use. Mage Hand gives you a lot of out-of-combat utility. Already that's very good, but it also has a bunch of in-combat utility, which is extremely powerful, although admittedly somewhat irritating to use, which is that it can throw objects. So if you drop a stack of healing potions, you can have your Mage Hand throw those at your allies in order to give them constant healing without spending actions yourself. You can also do this with aggressive objects like Alchemist's Fire, though enemies will sometimes target that and they'll set your Mage Hand on fire and kill it. So you do have to be pretty careful with where you place explosives and things like that. This is especially good with the invisible versions of Mage Hand that Arcane Tricksters and Githyanki get. The Arcane Trickster one also lasts all day, so you can use it as an ideal scout. But even for characters that don't get the special Mage Hand versions, that's still a very, very powerful tool, although admittedly a lot of micro. The other thing is that because it has only 3 HP and 5 AC, enemies will target it with their attacks. And a spell that you cast that basically blocks one attack from an ally that you can cast before combat starts is a pretty powerful tool. Casting Mage Hand before combat begins, and then an enemy wastes their first attack on shooting the Mage Hand instead of shooting something you actually care about, is a pretty powerful use of a short rest cooldown. So this just gives you a lot of utility, both in and out of combat. The fact that it is a little bit unreliable because enemies can kill it very easily does limit the effectiveness of this in combat, but out of combat it's still very good, and I think that most parties should try to have it just for the out of combat utility, even if you don't use the potion throwing stuff. If you do, then it's even better, but A tier for Mage Hand. Minor Illusion. So this is my favorite spell in Baldur's Gate 3. Someday I'm going to do a 5-hour video talking about all the uses of Minor Illusion, but for now I will just go over a couple of the highlights. This is the most versatile spell in the game with a ludicrous number of possible uses. How it works is that when you cast the illusion, characters, NPCs who can see it will walk towards it. So they'll turn to look at it and they'll go group up around it. This is useful in a ridiculous number of situations. Firstly, you can use it to move neutral characters or friendly characters, so you can steal their stuff. Have them walk out of their shop, so they go look at a cat, and then you take all the things in the shop. Very easy in that case. It can also be used to turn characters so that they are not looking at where you want to hide. So you can set up ambushes or hide a character who would otherwise be in line of sight. Against enemies, it's even better. They'll group up around the minor illusion when you cast it, so they'll walk towards it, and that means that they will be perfectly clustered to be hit with an area of effect spell. Have enemies all walk towards the minor illusion, then hit them with a hypnotic pattern and they all get knocked out, the fight is over before it ever began. You can make even better use of this if you place the minor illusion near a hazardous location. Put it on the edge of a cliff, all the enemies walk over to the edge of the cliff, and you're ready to shove them right off of it. It has even more uses than that. It can be cast while hidden, and it can be cast while silent, so you can direct enemies around. And you don't have to use it on every enemy in an encounter. Enemies who can't see each other won't aggro if you are killing their friends, so you can use a series of minor illusion casts to pull enemies one at a time into a different room and pick them off instead of having to take on the entire encounter all at once. This is just a very small sample of the ludicrous number of possible uses that moving enemies around with no saving throw, no dice rolled at all, and not having to enter combat or unhide gives you. Minor Illusion is just ridiculously powerful, ridiculously versatile, and one of the best ways to improve at the game is to practice using Minor Illusion in order to gain advantages before fights start. It will give you a much deeper understanding of the mechanics and make every fight in the game much easier. S tier, every single party should have access to Minor Illusion. It is just so incredibly good. Poison Spray. Poison Spray is another damage cantrip, and it starts really well. It's got a D12 of damage, which is higher than any damage cantrip that we've seen so far, and goes up to 2d12 and then 3d12. But it's poison damage, which is probably the worst type of damage in the game, because so many enemies are resistant to it or ignore it entirely. And it targets a Constitution save, which is the worst save to target, because on average, enemies will have better Constitution saves than anything else. To top that all off, it has a 10-foot range. Almost any other damaging cantrip in the game has a 60-foot range, so Poison Spray, in exchange for doing a little bit more damage, is wildly less reliable, has very, very short range, so it's going to put your casters in danger if you ever try to actually cast it, and on average is just going to be less damage than a spell that targets enemy armor class anyways, even if you happen to be fighting an enemy who doesn't ignore the damage completely. There's just no case where you want Poison Spray over other damaging cantrips. D tier. Produce Flame. So Produce Flame is a little more complicated than most other cantrips because it's a modal spell. It has two separate modes depending on whether you activate its second ability. When you cast it, it summons effectively a torch. It's a 30-foot light that works basically like the light spell, and you can hold on to it until you activate the second ability. When you activate the second ability, it turns your light into effectively a firebolt, but with only 30-foot range and only a d8 of fire damage. So you target an enemy's armor class, throw the Produce Flame at them for a d8 of fire damage, increasing at later levels, and in a 30-foot range. As a damage spell, that's obviously weaker than spells with 60-foot range that do more damage and are, generally speaking, more reliable. And as a light spell, I think generally you're going to prefer light to Produce Flame, just because you can cast it on an ally rather than having to have it on yourself, so it's got a lot more utility overall. The two things together do give Produce Flame some pretty nice usage. And the other important thing about Produce Flame is that it's a druid and cleric spell, rather than a wizard and sorcerer spell, so characters that can cast Produce Flame can't cast Firebolt. So you're not really comparing the two directly together for most characters that are using it. However, Produce Flame, which I used to think was the best damage spell for druids and clerics, got a lot worse with the addition of a patch 8 spell, Toll the Dead, which now means that clerics have a way better damage spell in the form of Toll the Dead compared to Produce Flame. So clerics are no longer really interested in this. And this is also one of the spells I'm changing because I misevaluated a different spell in my previous cantrip tier list. Druids would rather use Shillelagh for their damage spell. So most characters that can use this have better damage options. It's still a nice package. Having light and a damaging effect in the same spell is still pretty good, so I'm going to put it in B tier and say it's useful to have Produce Flame, but it's not one that you are going to be desperate for. The other thing about Produce Flame that's worth mentioning is that on console, the casting interface is broken completely, and even on PC, it's very irritating. So personally, I recommend not using this spell just because it is kind of annoying to actually cast and use, unless you are using a mod to fix the casting interface. Ray of Frost. Ray of Frost is a sorcerer and wizard damage spell, 60-foot range attack roll, just like Bone Chill and Firebolt, so directly compares to those, and does a d8 of cold damage, less damage than Firebolt, the same as Bone Chill, and enemies hit by it have their movement speed reduced by 10 feet for 1 turn. This is incredible for a number of reasons, and Ray of Frost is the gold standard damage spell for sorcerers and wizards, and the one that they're almost always going to use most often. Reducing enemy movement speed is excellent for a spellcaster. Imagine that you're 60 feet away from an enemy, you hit them with Ray of Frost, and now that enemy can't even get to you on their turn. Even if they spend their whole turn moving, they spend their action as well, they'll only go 40 feet and you'll still be 20 feet away from them. On your next turn, you hit them with Ray of Frost again, move 30 feet away, they still can't reach you. So you can use Ray of Frost as a stun, as long as you can keep moving backwards away from enemies. In addition to that, it's cold damage, and in Baldur's Gate 3, cold and lightning damage are doubled if the enemy is wet. So if you have hit them with a water bottle or cast Create Water on them, they'll take double damage from Ray of Frost, meaning that it will often be the highest damage cantrip available. And because it's cold damage, it can freeze surfaces. So water on the ground, alcohol on the ground, blood on the ground, you can turn to ice. Enemies who walk on ice have to make a dexterity saving throw or fall prone. And if they fall prone on their turn, they skip the rest of their turn. So it becomes a stun every time they walk on an ice surface. The utility of stunning enemies with ice surfaces, effectively stunning them by being able to kite them backwards, slowing their movement speed, and the fact that this is just usually going to be the most damage of any cantrip available to sorcerers and wizards, because it's already really good and then you can double it with the wet condition, means Ray of Frost is just the best damage cantrip for these characters, and it would be a rare party that doesn't benefit from using this spell frequently. S tier for Ray of Frost, just incredible. Resistance. Resistance is a concentration cantrip that gives the target an extra 1d4 on any saving throws they make for 10 turns. This is okay if used in actual combat. If you have nothing else to concentrate on, you can cast Resistance before combat starts on an ally who might be having to make saving throws, and that bonus is always going to be fairly useful, so it does give them a little bit of a bonus. It's also a concentration spell, so similar to Guidance, you can use it with anything that synergizes with a concentration spell, but by itself, the combat usage would not be enough to push Resistance over the top. However, there's lots of times where you make saving throws that you know are coming in advance outside of combat. If you are going to disarm a trap and might fail, casting Resistance on that character ahead of time makes them more likely to avoid the negative consequences. There's a lot of dialogues in which you're going to have to make saving throws. Say if someone is trying to mind control you, or if you're making saving throws for certain story events, having Resistance will just help if you know that those are coming, or you can cast it in response to a lot of dialogue saving throws as well, as long as you have it in your party. The out-of-combat utility of Resistance is really, really high. So while it won't come up that often in combat, you'll usually have better things to do. It can, but mostly you're going to be using this for out-of-combat stuff, and it is very useful for that. There aren't that many events where it's really important, but there are enough that you should usually try to get this. B tier for Resistance. Sacred Flame. So this is another cantrip where the evaluation of this spell has changed significantly since patch 8 released. Sacred Flame is a cleric cantrip that does a d8 of radiant damage to one target if they fail their dexterity saving throw. It will obviously increase damage at later levels, but because it targets a dex save, it is often going to fail at early levels, which is where the memes of Shadowheart missing all of her attacks come from. Targeting a dexterity save for a d8 of damage is just not very impressive, but when clerics had this as their best saving throw targeting option, it was still a moderately useful spell for them. But with the release of Toll the Dead, which is a wisdom targeting save, so will be typically much more likely to succeed, and does more damage, Sacred Flame has pretty much lost its role entirely. The fact that it's radiant damage can be a little bit relevant, and there are some enemies where you wouldn't want to hit them with Produce Flame and you wouldn't want to hit them with Toll the Dead because their AC and wisdom saves are higher than their dexterity saves, but I can't think of any off the top of my head that are like that, and that would be a pretty rare combination. So Sacred Flame just really doesn't have a role anymore. Toll the Dead has eaten it completely. D tier for Sacred Flame. Shillelagh, which yes, is how you pronounce it. Shillelagh is a druid cantrip that turns a staff or club that you're holding into a magical weapon, making it do a d8 of base damage, no matter what its damage was before, and it adds your spellcasting modifier, usually wisdom if you're a druid, to your damage as well, and uses wisdom to roll its chance to hit. So you get a melee weapon based off your spellcasting modifier that does a d8 of damage. It lasts for 10 turns, requires a bonus action, and takes no concentration, so you can use it in order to get a lot of melee attacks anytime you're playing a druid. Druids don't mind being in melee. They have decent hit points and good armor proficiencies, so they can get up into melee and use their Shillelagh attacks. And in the early game, it's a lot of damage. A d8 plus your wisdom modifier is already an okay weapon, but in particular, Shillelagh works well with weapons that have additional damage dice added to them. Imagine a non-magical torch, one of the first things that you get in the game. It does a d4 bludgeoning damage and a d4 fire damage if it's lit. If you cast Shillelagh on it, because it counts as a club, then it will deal a d8 of bludgeoning damage, a d4 of fire damage, add your wisdom, and use your wisdom to attack, so you don't need to have high strength in order to deal a lot of damage. A d8 plus a d4 plus 3, if you have 16 wisdom, is 10 average damage, which is the same average damage that a fighter with a greatsword does on their swings. So a druid casting Shillelagh now has a melee weapon that's the equal of dedicated melee characters at early levels. That makes it one of the most dangerous early game melee combatants in the game, and it gets even better if you add extra damage to it by playing a Spore Druid or something like that. That's so much damage that it makes druids amongst the most dangerous early game combatants. And so pretty much every druid is going to use Shillelagh. It's also especially synergistic for druid, because if you get in trouble because you're wading into melee combat, you could just wild shape and gain a whole extra hit point bar, because it'll restore your hit HP to the full wild shape hit points. So it means that druids are just unbelievably strong early game characters, and it's all thanks to this spell. For that reason, I think that Shillelagh, which I badly underrated in my previous cantrip tier list, is an S tier spell, and no druid should leave home without it. Shocking Grasp. Get ready, because this one may well shock you. Shocking Grasp is a melee range damage cantrip that targets enemy armor class and does a d8 of lightning damage, going up to 2d8 at level 5 and 3d8 at level 10. Because it's lightning damage, it can of course be doubled using the wet condition, and because it targets armor class, you can critically hit with it to double it even further, so there's ways that you can spike the damage significantly, very similar to Ray of Frost. In addition to this, it has two other bonus effects. The first is that when you attack an enemy who has metal armor on, you have advantage on the attack roll with Shocking Grasp. Now, in Baldur's Gate 3, not every enemy who should qualify as having metal armor on does, because they just weren't as thorough as they maybe should have been when tagging enemies to gain the advantage on Shocking Grasp. So you won't always get this bonus when you think you should, but it will come up sometimes, especially against melee enemies, who are the ones you're most likely to find yourself in melee range of as a spellcaster. The second effect is that when you hit an enemy with Shocking Grasp, it applies the shocked condition, preventing them from using their reaction. This is a pretty reasonable debuff, especially on a cantrip. So it will prevent enemies from making their attacks of opportunity. So if a melee character gets up close to your wizard, you can shocking grasp them and then run away without them hitting you back. It can prevent them from using counter spells. So with another spellcaster or a hasted action, you can shocking grasp first and then cast a counter spell, cast a spell you don't want counterspelled afterwards. And in honor mode, there's a lot of bosses that have reactions as legendary actions that shocking grasp can prevent them from using. So it's got a lot of upsides, but one extremely severe downside, which is that it's a wizard and sorcerer spell that requires you to be in melee range. So the question is, are the upsides of the spell, which are real, worth the severe downside of being melee only? And the answer is basically no, it's not. Shocking Grasp suffers from the problem of being a solution to a problem that is too severe for you to want to use a cantrip on. If your spellcaster, your wizard or sorcerer who can cast Shocking Grasp, is in melee range of the enemy, something has gone wrong in that fight, almost certainly, because that's usually not a desirable outcome. If the fight is turning against you and enemy melee characters are getting on top of your squishy backline characters, that is not the time to conserve resources by using a cantrip. That's the time to spend resources to stop things from getting worse. So if that happens, you should be looking to use a real spell slot like Hold Person to lock down the enemy or Misty Step to escape to safety, rather than relying on a cantrip, because things are important enough that you should want to spend resources if the fight is in that situation in the first place. In order for Shocking Grasp to be the best use of your action compared to casting another damaging cantrip, firing a hand crossbow that you might have in your inventory, or of course using an actual resource like a scroll or spell slot, you need to be in a pretty narrow set of circumstances. You need to be in melee range with an enemy who has a reaction that you want to remove. So you have to care about that enemy's reaction, because that's what differentiates Shocking Grasp from other damaging cantrips. If you didn't care about their reaction, you'd simply use Ray of Frost instead. However, that enemy has to also not be so threatening that you actually care about getting them out of the fight, because then you would want to spend a real resource in order to take them out of the fight, whether that be a spell slot or a resource to get your wizard to safety so that that dangerous enemy didn't kill them when it came back around to their turn. The enemy also needs to not be dying on before their next turn, because if you are killing them before their next turn, it doesn't matter that they're in melee range with your wizard or sorcerer, because they're not going to act anyways. So you can just have them cast another spell while your allies or whoever were going to kill that enemy go ahead and do that. That's a rare enough set of circumstances that it really leaves the spell in kind of an awkward spot. If you need to solve the problem that Shocking Grasp solves, you really want a reliable solution, so it's the time to spend resources on making sure that that happens. And if you didn't need to solve the problem that it solves, then you were going to do something else with your turn anyways. So it's very rare that it's actually right to spend your turn casting Shocking Grasp. There are a couple characters that are exceptions to this rule in some ways, because if being in melee isn't a downside for you, then Shocking Grasp is much more attractive. Sorcerer Paladin multiclass can use Shocking Grasp reasonably effectively. An Abjuration Wizard can use Shocking Grasp pretty effectively as well, because those characters are happy to go to engage in melee, since they are intended to be upfront, and it's not actually a downside to put them in melee range to use Shocking Grasp. That being said, the Sorcerer Paladin probably is just going to attack with a weapon if they want to do damage, and if either of those characters wants to prevent the enemy from taking a reaction, they can usually just step out of melee range with them and provoke an attack of opportunity, which also doesn't cost your action at all. If you're okay with them being in melee range, you're usually okay taking a little damage to stop an reaction, and then you can cast your spells with impunity. So there just are not that many characters and circumstances that really want this spell. For that reason, I'm going to put it in C tier. Now, it's also worth mentioning that this is a hot take. Lots of people love this spell and have opinions on it that strongly differ from mine. I think my opinion is correct, or I would have a different opinion, but it's worth mentioning that a lot of people disagree with me, and I'm sure that you can see a lot of their reasoning in long essays in the comments below, so you can get a more complete picture. I'm presenting what I believe to be the truth, but other people have different interpretations. Thaumaturgy. Thaumaturgy gives you advantage on intimidation and performance checks, so very similar to Friends, it will give you advantage on some dialogue checks, but unlike Friends, it only applies to those two, and those are the two least useful of the charisma-based skills. It's available to clerics, who typically are not going to be your party face, so won't get a lot of use out of Thaumaturgy. Most clerics are not making a lot of intimidation checks. And giant barbarians, who do get a lot of use out of it, because barbarians have unique intimidation dialogues, having advantage on those from Thaumaturgy, from being a giant barbarian or a Zariel tiefling like Karlach, can be very, very helpful. That being said, even with those dialogues, your barbarian is not always going to be your party face, so only some party configurations are actually going to make use of Thaumaturgy, because a lot of the time your face character is going to have friends, which is usually strictly better. However, there is one significant upside to Thaumaturgy compared to Friends, which is that it's not a crime. And so you can use it without having to do the whole dance of fast traveling away or hiding or whatever, and not waste your real life actual time on waiting for the Friends cooldown to go away. So if you, like me, dislike doing that, then Thaumaturgy can make a great alternative if you have a character that has access to both. For most barbarians and clerics, Thaumaturgy is useful to take, but not that important. And for characters that have access to Friends, Friends is usually going to be better. So I'm going to say that Thaumaturgy is a C-tier spell, but bump this up a little bit if, like me, you find Friends irritating to use. Thorn Whip. Thorn Whip is a druid cantrip with 30-foot range that does a d6 of piercing damage, gaining an extra d6 at each level breakpoint, and then pulls the enemy that you hit 10 feet closer to you. It's an attack roll, so it will target their armor class, and there is no saving throw on the pull. If you hit them, then Thorn Whip will pull them. 30-foot range is a real downside. It makes it much harder to pull enemies from locations where you really want to pull them from, like high cliffs and stuff are much harder to get in range of hitting them with Thorn Whip. But repositioning enemies is always really powerful. An enemy on top of a cliff can be pulled down to meet you in melee range and take some fall damage as a result. Enemies who are in hazardous locations can be pulled, or who have backed away out of hazardous areas can be pulled back into them. So if you have like a spike growth on the ground and the enemy has backed out of it, you can pull them back into it. And speaking of spike growth, it counts as moving over the spike growth if you pull an enemy with Thorn Whip, so they take extra spike growth damage for a pretty significant burst damage combo. Shillelagh is the better of the damage spells for druids because it's just very reliable, and if you need a ranged damage spell, Produce Flame is usually more damage, but Thorn Whip is still a very solid spell with a lot of implications because moving enemies is just always really powerful. And while this is a more situational spell, you won't cast it in every combat, it's one that will come up and be very good when it does. For that reason, I'm going to put it in B tier, the useful tier, because this is a spell that druids will like to have and will cast reasonably frequently. Toll the Dead. Toll the Dead is one of the new cantrips available in patch 8. It's available to clerics, warlocks, and wizards, and is a damage cantrip. It does a d8 of necrotic damage at a 60-foot range, with a wisdom save to negate it. But if enemies are not at full health, if they've taken any damage at all, that d8 increases to a d12. That is true for higher level versions of the spell as well. So at level 5, it'll deal 2d12 to a damaged enemy, and at level 10, it'll deal 3d12 to a damaged enemy, which is pretty respectable for a cantrip. That's the highest damage output that a cantrip can do, other than Eldritch Blast or doubling cold and lightning damage with the wet condition. So it's a very solid damage output, and although saving throws are usually worse to target with cantrips than armor class, a wisdom save is not a bad one for Toll the Dead to target, because enemies who have high armor class, and so you won't want to use a spell like Bone Chill to attack their AC, will often have low wisdom saves and vice versa. So it gives you optionality, and you can use the right spell to target the right enemies and make sure that you actually hit them. For wizards and warlocks, Toll the Dead is not that impactful in addition. For wizards, they have Ray of Frost, which is usually a better damage spell, and warlocks have Eldritch Blast, so don't need any other damage cantrip usually. But for clerics, Toll the Dead is a massive upgrade. Toll the Dead is very similar to Sacred Flame, but does more damage and targets a better save, so is way more reliable, and just makes clerics significantly stronger, especially in the early game. One of the things that clerics struggled with was just not having reliable early game damage, unless you're playing specific cleric subclasses that do. Toll the Dead entirely fixes that problem, because now you have a really good damaging cantrip. You can also combine it with Produce Flame to have one that targets AC and one that targets a save, and be able to just hit enemies extremely reliably. Now, I think it is still worse than some other damaging cantrips, but Toll the Dead is just a very solid addition, and pretty much every cleric is going to take it. I'm going to put it in A tier, though I think you could say S tier as well, because wizards and warlocks won't grab it, but clerics almost always will. True Strike. So True Strike is of course a bit of a joke on this channel, but I am going to do an actual analysis of the spell and we'll look at its strengths and weaknesses. You're going to see a lot of people saying that True Strike is completely 100% useless all the time, and that's actually not entirely true, though it's close enough that if you used it as a heuristic, you wouldn't be losing out on that much. The reason that True Strike isn't particularly good is that how it works is it requires your concentration, is cast on yourself, and for 2 turns gives you advantage on your next attack. So your next attack after casting True Strike is going to have advantage. This means that you're spending your action, so 1 full turn, in order to get advantage on your next attack. In most circumstances, you could have simply made 2 attacks, which is like having advantage, except that you could also just hit with both of them, so it's just better than having advantage on your attacks. That means that True Strike is just not going to be that useful in combat, because when you spend an action on it, it significantly hampers your ability to do damage, and is counterproductive, and that's even assuming that you don't have extra attack and stuff like that, where spending your action is even worse. It also eats your concentration, which is a very important resource. However, there is a real use case for True Strike, because it lasts for 2 turns, and that is casting it before combat starts. Gaining advantage on the first attack that you make in combat is a reasonably real bonus. A lot of the time you can get this by hiding, but in some cases, there are arenas where you can't easily hide before combat starts, and so having True Strike running can give you advantage on your first attack. Is that worth taking it as a cantrip? Not really, but it is a real use case. Another real use case for True Strike is it gives you advantage on your next attack roll, no matter what that attack roll is. So if you're about to cast a spell that requires an attack roll, you can use True Strike in order to make it less likely that you waste the spell slot. Or if you're about to use something like a special arrow, then you can use True Strike to make it less likely that you miss with that arrow and lose it. So it can help you conserve resources. If you're about to spend an important resource, then True Strike can make it less likely to fail. But in general, you're still going to be better off just spending your action doing something else. Usually, if you are really worried about missing your special arrow, you could just spend your action to hide and get an advantage without having to spend your concentration, cast a spell, and have a mostly useless cantrip. So while True Strike does have some extremely marginal use cases, most of the time it doesn't, and we're going to put it in D tier, but I did want to mention the times where it does actually come up, because you will see people saying it never has any uses, and that's not entirely true. And finally, Vicious Mockery. Vicious Mockery is a bard spell that does a d4 of psychic damage if the enemy fails a wisdom save at 60-foot range, going up, of course, to 2d4 and then 3d4, so significantly less damage than other damaging cantrips. If they do fail the save, though, then they also gain disadvantage on their next attack roll, which can mitigate damage pretty significantly, especially in the early game, where enemies with disadvantage are very likely to miss their next attack. While this only applies to 1 attack roll, unlike Bone Chill, which gives undead disadvantage on all their attack rolls for a turn, in the early game most enemies only have 1 attack, so that'll still give them disadvantage in a pretty relevant way. The problem with this spell is just that it's so low damage that there aren't that many circumstances where you wouldn't rather just fire a bow. Most bards are going to have access to a bow or hand crossbow or something like that, and can deal a d6 of damage plus their dexterity modifier, which is way more than a d4 in the early game, because you'll have both 16s in both charisma and dexterity. So early on, you are better off just using a ranged weapon rather than casting Vicious Mockery if you want to do damage. So you would only cast this spell if the disadvantage on the attack was relevant, and it won't always be. There's also lots of other ways to give enemies disadvantage if you need to do that. So Vicious Mockery is sort of similar to Shocking Grasp in that there's usually just something better to do with your turn. If you really need to stop the enemy from attacking you, you should spend a spell slot on that. And if you don't need this, if you don't need the debuff from Vicious Mockery, you're better off just dealing more damage in most circumstances. At later levels, the math kind of changes, because at high levels, if you're, say, a lore bard or something like that, then you'll have high charisma and won't have increased your dexterity much, so your weapon damage will be less reliable and not as high, and Vicious Mockery can come back into its own. So for a late game bard, Vicious Mockery starts making a lot more sense as something to do if you don't have anything important that you need to do on your turn. It can be a great filler action for that. For that reason, I'm going to give it C tier. Cantrips are most impactful in the early game when you have the smallest amount of other stuff that you want to do with your turns. And in the early game, it's almost always better to just fire a bow instead rather than casting this spell. So it just doesn't come up that often. That being said, of course, it's a hilarious spell that's incredibly fun to use. So I still recommend giving it to every character that can take it, just so that you can enjoy all the amazing voice acting that goes along with casting this spell. Alright, my friends, I hope that you have enjoyed this updated look at the cantrips in Baldur's Gate 3. Here's the final list. Definitely let me know if there's anything that you would move around and what your reasons for that are. Always interested in hearing everyone's thoughts. And of course, I've moved things around in the past. As you can see from this list, it's quite different from my last one. So I'm very open to being convinced if you have good reasons to move things around. Of course, if you have enjoyed the video, feel free to leave a comment and hit like just in general. Always very helpful with the algorithm. So I appreciate people taking the time to do that. I don't know if I'm going to continue and update all of my other spell tier lists. The cantrips one is the one that almost certainly is going to change the most because of patch 8 changes and because it was the first one that I did and everything. But if there's interest, then I definitely might, so let me know if you're interested in seeing that as well. And of course, you can subscribe to my channel for more Baldur's Gate 3 build guides and other strategy game analysis. Cheers, folks. I'll catch you next time.